Here's a guy who thinks you shouldn't find skeptics convincing.
I've been on YouTube for about 2 years now, and prior to that, I spent countless hours debating skeptics online daily for well over a year. Since I regularly deal with so many online skeptics these days, I've come to the sad conclusion that most of them tragically suffer from ARCS, which is an abbreviation for the technical term anti-religious cliche sloganism.
That's Rich coming from the side that loves to spam "the fool has said in his heart there is no God" over and over again.
Or even its more progressive form, DSO, which is short for Dawkinitis Silly Objectionism, which has most likely prompted its victims to already have hit the dislike button by the time they've even reached this point in the video.
Apologists talk about Dawkins far more often than atheists do nowadays. They treat him like he's the Pope of atheism when his relevance and influence has been steeply declining for years.
Then let's go! There's an old joke that goes something like this. There was a man who was convinced that he was dead, but in reality he was very much alive. His delusion became such a problem that his family paid for him to see a psychiatrist. Now, the psychiatrist spent a ton of sessions trying to convince the man that he was still alive, but nothing seemed to work. The psychiatrist showed him his heart rate and everything, but he was still unconvinced. Finally, the doctor tried one last approach. He took out his medical books and proceeded to show the man that dead men do not bleed. After hours of tedious study, the man seemed convinced that the doctor was right in stating that dead men don't bleed. So the doctor said, "Do you now agree that dead men don't bleed?" "Yes, I do," the man replied. "Ah, very well then," the doctor said as he took out a needle and pricked the man's finger. And out came a trickle of blood, and the man stared at it as it poured out of his fingertip. Now, the doctor began to smile because now he was convinced that he finally got through to the guy. So he asked the man, he said, "Ah, now, what does that tell you?" And the man says, "Oh my goodness." And then he continued to stare at his finger in disbelief and said, "I guess dead men bleed after all."
I've always been clear about what would convince me that a God exists. Give me a definition that I can recognize as coherent, and evidence that can falsifiably and most parsimoniously be explained by the existence of God. I've never moved that goalpost.
So now the point of the joke, of course, is that people can be so committed to what they don't want to believe that they'll ignore or reshape all of the evidence that goes against the things that they don't like. Now, this is somewhat human nature. We all do this to some certain extent in some cases, but it's made far worse when, like the man in the story, they don't offer any positive reasons for why they're correct. This leaves them especially open to being deceived by others and deceiving themselves without even realizing it. Now, instead of giving reasons for their beliefs, they subconsciously seek to only find ways to rationalize or reject all of the evidence that goes against what they don't want to believe. And this leads us to the first reason that a lot of atheists and skeptics might sound persuasive even though they shouldn't. It's far easier to deny something than to argue for something.
It's far easier to prove that something does exist, if it in fact does, than it is to prove that something doesn't exist. Proving Bigfoot exists just requires producing a specimen. Proving Bigfoot doesn't exist is literally impossible. It's one of those negatives that can't be proven. Perhaps what this guy means, though, is that it's harder to prove a statement true than to simply not have an opinion on it. That's true, but why would not having an opinion require a burden of proof?
This first reason has to do with the fact that atheists have recently incorporated a definition of atheism that's foreign to the historical philosophical definition of the word atheism. So now, it used to be that atheism meant that you believe that the proposition God does not exist is a true proposition.
It still means that, it just doesn't only mean that. Many atheists nowadays also refer to agnostics as atheists, in addition to the folks who affirm the non-existence of God.
But unfortunately, that position requires a decent amount of critical thinking, and it would also come with the burden of proof.
No, it wouldn't. Not necessarily. No belief or position per se comes with a burden of proof. A claim only has a burden of proof when you try to convince someone else to believe it. Someone who is not trying to convince anyone of their belief obviously has no obligation to prove it. I don't insist that theists prove that a God exists unless they are trying to convince me that a God exists. Also, even if atheists are not claiming that a God does not exist, but are claiming that the evidence presented for God is insufficient, I think that claim does carry a burden of proof insofar as they are trying to convince someone else that said claim is true.
That's something that atheists online today try to avoid like the Black Plague. You may as well call the burden of proof pimples or loneliness or wanting to see David Wood in his underwear. Granted, these are things that no one wants, but for some reason, it's only the ARCS type who are terrified of the burden of proof. Now, instead of holding to the historical definition of atheism, they prefer the definition of atheism being nothing more than a mere lack of belief, which means that you could literally be as dumb as a brick and still be an atheist. Since you don't have to actually believe anything in order to qualify as an atheist, you only need to lack a belief in order to qualify as an atheist.
Yes, agnosticism is not a claim about God, but rather a doxastic stance relative to the existence of God.
Now, that's fine, of course, if they want to identify with a position that's equally applicable to a brain-dead person or a pet rock. That's fine by me.
This is poisoning the well. He's trying to paint abstaining from taking a position on the issue as something contemptible. If you don't believe that you have enough information to take a position on any particular issue, the responsible thing to do is to not take a position on that issue, despite the fact that a rock would also abstain from taking a position.
However, it's kind of ironic when they pick at theism, because theism by definition requires a functioning brain, but somehow these atheists have concluded that intelligent people use their intelligence to define themselves into a position that literally doesn't require a single shred of intelligence in order to hold the position.
I wouldn't even use the word position to describe a lack of belief in something. It's more like a lack of a position.
Riddle me that one. Thankfully, this thoughtless form of atheism isn't even a thing in academia, which means that our school system hasn't entirely jumped ship just yet. Virtually every philosopher in academia who happens to be an atheist wouldn't dare give such a ridiculous definition. The only problem is we're at a new time in history where feelings just don't care about your facts.
This dude says this as though Christians haven't been a major contributor to that problem.
This leaves these new online skeptics to keep their burden of proof allergies inside of their echo chamber without being very skeptical of what their favorite skeptics tell them. Now, I'm not a hater. I always give props where props are due, so I'm not going to sit here and act like their position doesn't come with any benefits. Using the definition of atheism being only a lack of belief allows them to demand simple answers to complex questions and then label the complex answer as word salad.
The complexity of the answers I get from apologists has nothing to do with whether I call them word salad. I've heard complex claims that I don't believe are word salad, and there are very simple claims that I do see as word salad. Word salad claims are ones that are not merely fallacious, like an argument that affirms the consequent or contains a false premise or something like that, but are rather claims which are altogether incoherent. For example, the claim that God is timeless and spaceless is very simple word salad.
That the definition allows them to frame the conversation in a way where they don't have to give arguments or defend anything that they actually believe.
Why would they have to defend beliefs that they're not trying to convince you to share?
They can just sit back and do their best to poke holes in arguments, never giving an alternate explanation.
I give alternate explanations for the beginning of the universe, the claims about Jesus' resurrection, the existence of morality, etc. However, I don't see why I would have to give an alternate explanation in response to a theistic explanation that is demonstrably nonsensical,
while the entire time feeling like they're actually doing something worthwhile. Now, I gotta admit, that's a pretty convenient strategy, since it's much harder to actually give arguments and evidence for your position instead of just sitting back and saying, hey, well, I don't believe you, or I'm not convinced, or hey, that's not evidence.
I always explain why I'm not convinced and what it would take to convince me.
And even better, sit back and play hyper-skeptic. As we just saw with the dead men don't bleed joke, hyper-skepticism knows no bounds and is virtually limitless.
That's denialism, which I think is meaningfully distinct from skepticism.
Now, if that's your strategy, again, I'm not a hater. Just don't be like this guy who complains when it's done to them.
But when you talk about intelligent design, you don't have anybody who's doing any evidence. You have the Wedge document. You have the Institute for Creation Research and other organizations that are similar to this, who are, instead of providing evidence for their position, merely trying to poke holes in the current model and failing to do so.
I don't see the problem with that objection. If creationists are neither presenting evidence for their position nor successfully demonstrating how evolution doesn't work, don't you think that's a problem for creationism? I also don't see how this is analogous to what atheists do, because when we poke holes in theism, we actually succeed in showing its incoherence.
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.